Going to look at the poem London by William Blake, and it's a very familiar poem and nearly always part of the power and conflict uh, group of poems that come into the GCSE English, the AQA at least. Here's the picture that he did. You remember he's something of an artist as well, and it's so an old man being led by a young one through London. And you can see it's rather faded script there, but you get the gist. And somebody warming themselves at a blaze there. Is that? What do you reckon that is? Okay, just going to read the poem and then glance at one or two of the points from it. Here we go. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So there's the poem. It creates a feeling of shock and horror, and it has a gloomy tone, doesn't it? Depressing, and as if he's shaking his head. The poem was published in 1794. Blake was appalled by the terrible conditions and poverty that he saw in London. But there is a really important context, and that is the French Revolution, which began in 1789, which was an overthrow of the monarchy and the aristocracy in France. And many people, especially at that early period of the French Revolution, many people saw it as a good thing, as a good example to follow, a way for ordinary people to take power and to make society more equal. And in this poem, Blake implies that the awful conditions for ordinary people in London might just be a fuse to the same explosion. They might trigger a similar revolution. Blake also didn't like established religion in Europe because it failed to help poor people, especially children who had to work in bad conditions. And you got this direct reference in the line, every blackening church appalls. It's a strong critique of, well, I suppose, religious hypocrisy, that the very people who setting themselves out as providing an answer were not doing so. So let's glance at the content. It's a journey. It's a journey through London, and it's like he's being invited to look. We're being invited to look through the eyes of the poet across the city and to think about the awful living conditions. And so there's a criticism about ownership, and it's this word chartered, the chartered Thames and the chartered street. And it's a reference to how rich people own everything. And as we said, he goes on to criticize the church for not doing enough to help the poor. And the last bit, the last stanza, discusses the horrors of prostitution, the youthful harlot. Rather awful phrase, isn't it? And sexually transmitted disease. So this is a fist in the face. It's really unsubtle and strong. And it's a discussion of, you might say, the anticipated conflict that arises from the wrong use of power. And this is how it arrives in a power and conflict curriculum. It's written in a very regular way. It's almost like a song. You think of like other of Blake's poetry, like Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright. And it's got that sing-song quality about it. There's 4 stanzas, and there's 4 snapshots of one aspect of the life in the city, and it's a A-B in the stanza. It's a very regular rhyme. And he uses repetition to emphasize important points. Chartered is repeated in the first stanza to show how everything in the city is owned by the rich and powerful. And the repetition of marks in stanza 2 shows the physical marks and scars on people due to their living conditions. And it also has a double meaning, as it could suggest the speaker recording or marking what he saw on the journey through London. It's a rather old-fashioned use of the word mark that. It's like making a remark about something. Mark it, notice it, pay attention to that. Now, as I said, the tone of the poem is very low, very dark, very somber, almost biblical. It's like a kind of prophetic voice. And Blake was interested in religion, was, you might say, passionately spiritual, but that very passion evoked a serious anger at the ineffectiveness of the church in his cultural context. So he uses, quite often, he uses religious style of language, or it sounds like it could be taken from the Bible, maybe. Okay. He also uses a lot of negative language, and just run through and see if you can pick out some examples. Now turn to imagery. There's some very powerful imagery in stanza 2. Think of this one: mind-forged manacles. Now, presumably that just means handcuffs, but the suggestion is that the structure of society imprisons ordinary people's minds. They can't think freely. They can't escape the terrible poverty they're in because their minds are blinkered. It's a perspective that has been narrowed by their poverty, by their conditions. And the last image is of a marriage hearse. So this is an oxymoron. Marriage celebrates love and new life, but a hearse is associated with funerals. And Blake, it shows how the poverty and prostitution and sexually transmitted diseases that he's described will bring nothing but death and decay. We're married to this awful, awful situation. Themes. It's a pessimistic poem reflecting horror at the living conditions of ordinary people. Charles Dickens was to do very much the same in books like Oliver Twist, that they're not celebrating, they're lifting up and gazing with horror at the conditions where so many people, the biggest city in the world, and where these people live and the conditions they live under. And Blake here reflects on how the powerful institutions, the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the church have done nothing to alleviate the poverty and the poor conditions. Okay, so we're just going to stop the video now and consider an exam question that might come out of this poem. That's okay, we'll do that in a different context. And I'll see you in the next session.